Hi, everybody, and most welcome to this first session of the ISTAT Learning Lab series. I am Nils Hallerström, and I'm the chair of ISTAT's Learning Lab. I'm very excited to have Dick Forsberg here today to open up this series, and he's going to talk about the post-COVID airline landscape. So Dick Forsberg, he's been in the industry for 47 years, and he's been working with airlines, operating lessors, and captain providers in a variety of roles spanning business strategy, industry analysis, forecasting, asset valuation, portfolio risk management, and credit assessment. He retired from Avalon in March of 2019, and he provides now advisory services and consultancy support for the industry. As a founding executive and head of strategy of Avalon, Dick's responsibilities included developing and promoting the company's business strategy with investors, lenders, and stakeholders, and defining the trading cycle of the business, providing the primary interface with the aircraft appraisal and valuation community, industry analysis and forecasting, and setting portfolio risk management criteria. Dick has published a number of white papers on key industry issues and is a regular speaker, moderator, and panelist at industry conferences and aviation schools. Before Avalon, Dick was working for RBS Aviation Capital and with GCAS and GPA after he had spent 20 years with the airline industry in the UK. Dick has a diploma in business studies and in marketing from the UK Institute of Marketing. On the board of ISTAT's International Appraiser Program. So you can understand that Dick is seriously qualified to have this session with us today. Welcome, Dick.
That introduction. Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. Like Niels, I'm delighted to be launching this series of ISTAT Online Learning Lab presentations today. These events are designed to keep you, the members, in touch with your organisation and its unrivaled network of industry professionals during these unprecedented times. As Niels said, my topic today is the post-COVID airline landscape, which frankly is a pretty difficult subject to present with any degree of certainty. We're still at such an early stage of the crisis, although I don't know about you, but to me, it certainly feels like it's been with us forever. I'm sure I'm not the only one struggling to remember what life was like before we all got locked away and Project Fear was unleashed. So I plan to speak for around an hour, which will leave time for Q&A. You will see on your screens there's a series of little blue and white buttons. One of those says Q&A, and if you click on that, you will be able to ask questions on the screen. Niels will be capturing those, and when we get to the end of the conversation, we'll get through as many of those questions as time allows. So in terms of the agenda, and hopefully that click-through is working. Good. So in terms of the agenda, I'm going to start by summarising where we are now and how we got here. And then I'll introduce the key issues that will determine how and when the airline industry plots a course through some sort of recovery process and what that recovery journey might look like. And then I'll move on and focus on key areas that airlines are going to have to work their way through as they prepare for the future. Right-sizing, restructuring, recapitalization. And I'll look at how fleets are already starting to be impacted and what that might imply, where that might lead. And then I'll talk about how the different airline business models may be affected and finish up with some pointers on where the airlines should be focusing as they reinvent themselves. Now, since the topic title specifically references airlines, I'm going to try and stay clear of equally fascinating topics, leasing, financing, the OEMs, MROs, and the like. But I'm sure that others were going to have an opportunity to cover those topics in future Learning Lab presentations. So, thinking about the current state of play, without wishing to state the obvious, the coronavirus pandemic has created an unprecedented and truly global level of disruption to lives, economies, travel, transport systems. And it's unlike any previous economic, social, or political event experienced in most people's lifetimes. And although its impact has been severe across all communities, sectors, and businesses, aviation is amongst the worst affected and is facing one of the longest and most difficult recoveries. Over the past several months, air transport services have been hit extraordinarily hard as the world has systematically shut down. Demand evaporated, leaving over 60% of the world's airline fleet, that's 18,000 aircraft, inactive at the peak of the crisis as the pandemic wave spread out across the globe. Perhaps ironically, China's airlines have had one of the lowest levels of fleet inactivity, with no more than 20 to 25% of their aircraft on the ground during the peak of the crisis. Granted, the fleet utilization was low and load factors were weak, but most Chinese airlines chose to keep the majority of their aircraft in flight-ready condition, rather than place them into long-term storage. Most other airlines around the world took a different view, often having their hands forced by government policy, actions, or instruction, and this rapidly led to those massive levels of fleet groundings. Many countries shut down completely, closing their borders, imposing quarantine on arriving passengers, locking down their populations. In many cases, all flying ceased, while others operated bare-bones operations amounting to no more than 5% of a normal schedule. Of course, there are a few exceptions, maybe the most visible being in the US, where airlines in receipt of CARES Act support have been obliged to maintain a minimum level of service across their networks, which has resulted in one of the lowest levels of fleet inactivity, but also incurred significant ongoing operating costs that have not been offset by equivalent amounts of revenue. Another notable exception has been the unprecedented use of passenger aircraft, mainly wide bodies, to operate cargo services. Initially, most of this flying was needed to maintain the supply of critical medical products and PPE. But the massive loss of belly-hold capacity as a result of grounding passenger fleets led to choke points developing in supply chains, not only for manufacturing and commerce, but also for critical supplies of foodstuffs and essentials. IATA is predicting a 57% decline in RPKs and a 50% reduction in airline revenues this year compared to 2019. That represents a revenue shortfall of $450 billion and translates into an additional net cash burn of over $60 billion this year for an airline industry that typically has liquidity to cover no more than 2 months without revenue. In this situation, cash is king and presents an existential threat for airlines as the crisis continues. Now, as airline traffic and forward bookings evaporated, it rapidly became critical for airlines to protect their liquidity by cutting cash outflow wherever possible. Grounding aircraft eliminated most, although not all, of their direct operating costs: fuel, airport charges, handling, catering, and some of the maintenance. But of course, some additional costs also had to be borne, notably those related to preparing aircraft for storage and having a third party manage that storage process. There are also significant fixed costs to deal with, and these typically make up around a third of an airline's total cost structure. The largest cover aircraft ownership and labour. And naturally, there have been extensive moves by airlines to furlough staff and engage with lessors and lenders for relief on rental and debt service payments. Those airlines that can have also been raising additional liquidity through loans in the capital markets, record amounts in fact. Many airlines have sought government assistance through cash infusions, forgiveness of taxes, user charges, and so forth. The responses have been varied. Some governments stepping in promptly, such as China and Norway. Other offers have come with strings attached. The US CARES package, for example, requires core services to be maintained, and stock warrants to be issued. Surprisingly, though, many governments are still considering their options, either unaware of the importance of aviation to their economy and society, or simply unable to afford a bailout. Another way for airlines to conserve cash is to cut capital expenditure. And airlines have been looking for ways to defer or cancel near to medium term aircraft deliveries and pausing their PDP payments to the OEMs. This has had an immediate impact on aircraft deliveries for the OEMs, but also carries a much longer dated potential for disruption as order books get reprofiled and scaled back. These measures have been pursued with varying degrees of success by every airline that's able to find leverage with their suppliers, financiers, and governments. As a result, some have been able to announce an ability to weather a further 9 to 12 months of inactivity. Norwegian's restructuring plan, for example, envisages a recommencement of flying starting only in April 2021. But others have been back in the market very quickly, selling seats for travel from the start of the summer season, even when government approval still seemed unlikely. A growing number are signalling their intention to use the crisis to substantially restructure, shrink their operations, their businesses. British Airways, for example, seeking to shed 12,000 employees. The largest US carriers are expecting to see a 20% reduction in operations later this year, after the CARES package expires. And Qantas is amongst the latest to announce cuts, shedding 6,000 jobs, reducing capacity. Unfortunately for some airlines, the measures have already come too late. Recovery is beyond their grasp. Since the start of 2020, over 30 airlines or airline groups have suspended operations or entered bankruptcy, administration, or restructuring processes. A dozen of these are already shuttered. And there are at least 50 more judged to be in a highly fragile state with a very real risk of falling victim to illiquidity or insolvency. So I mentioned the number of airlines that are availing of government support. Although several high-profile operators have publicly refused to seek or take taxpayer money, the majority of airlines don't have that luxury. Even amongst erstwhile peers, there are differences of approach. Ryanair, for example, has denounced government bailouts as unfairly tilting the playing field, and in Europe, as being against the spirit and the letter of EU competition law. EasyJet, on the other hand, has accepted a £600 million loan backed by the UK's COVID corporate funding facility. While Ryanair is correct in the pure legal sense, there are valid arguments as to why government should be taking measures to protect the survival of their airlines. Aviation is a critical element of any country's economy and infrastructure, and there are serious and long-lasting implications to losing sovereign air connectivity. But there's also a strong argument that any support that goes beyond providing short-dated liquidity infusions does give an unfair advantage. Even short-term support places a heavy burden on taxpayers, and I don't think it's unreasonable for governments to seek a moderate equity stake in the airlines that they're shoring up, as long as the intention is to secure a share in any future financial upside to repay taxpayers for their support. And the intention is not to exert influence and control. You can see from this map, kindly prepared by Ishka, updated at the start of the month, the majority of countries outside of Africa and the Middle East are now either benefiting from or are waiting for decisions on state aid. In only a small number of cases is nationalisation favoured over arm-length financial support. The quantum of committed support has already substantially surpassed $100 billion. But this number is surely going to go a good deal higher. And while this will help to ensure near-term survival, it also in many cases will create serious long-term challenges for the airlines, creating unmanageable debt levels that will weigh down balance sheets and create financial headwinds. But as the money pours in to shore up airline finances, the rationale for this focus on liquidity is clear and entirely understandable. Access to cash and liquid assets is now the principal weapon in an airline's armory to fend off insolvency, restructuring, and shutdown. If you pick any one of the regions shown on this chart, you'll see that the lower end of the range of airlines' access to cash is close to zero, everywhere except for the Middle East. While there are generally some airlines in each region with access to substantial amounts of dry powder, the median level of liquidity for the airline industry is indeed around 2 months. Unless those at the lower end of the ranges can shore up their finances, and quickly, they will struggle to survive the course of the pandemic and its recovery. Bear with me, I'm struggling to move on to the next slide. I'm sure I will do that in a second. Thank you. One question that's increasingly being asked is, how come the cargo operators are doing so well? Is this a sign that air freight has turned the corner and is set for a bright future? Well, unfortunately, I think the short answer is no. Over the past few months, as passenger airline networks have shut down, air freight capacity has fallen away in tandem, especially in the long-haul wide-body markets, where belly-hold capacity plays a critical role in supporting the air freight market. And with belly-hold capacity virtually extinguished, the dedicated pure freighter operators have been enjoying an unprecedented period of activity. The addition to the freighter fleets of a number of passenger wide-bodies adapted to carry main-deck cargo, either strapped down on the seats or in cabins that have been stripped of seats and monuments, has also helped to take the pressure off the supply of essential goods. The headlines have tended to focus on the lifeline provision of essential medical supplies and PPE, but the demand is far wider than this, as manufacturing and retail supply chains have been experiencing severe bottlenecks. Amazon is not the only one announcing an expansion of their freighter fleet to meet not only current but also future demand surges. But shortages will become less critical over time, and indeed there are already indications that cargo demand is slowing up. Beyond the near term, the underlying fundamentals of air freight are weak and will become weaker as a deep global recession reduces manufacturing, consumer demand, and trade flows. The WTO is predicting world trade flows to decline by between 19 and 32% this year. Even at the most optimistic end of the scale, the outcome in 2020 will be 3 to 4 times worse than 2019. And that was the worst year for air cargo in a decade. In the longer term, the outlook for globalization is uncertain, with trade disputes creating more downside risk, while the experiences of COVID-19 and the wider implication of China's glowing footprint are likely to promote an increase in manufacturing onshoring and a move away from just-in-time supply chains. So I think it's safe to say that a shake-up in the air cargo sector is on the way. Sorry, could we have the next slide, please? I don't seem to be able to click them on for some reason. Okay, moving on to the next part of the discussion. What might the process of recovery look like? What factors need to fall into place to give airlines and passengers the confidence to begin to make travel plans once again? Next slide. This pandemic, or at least the response to it from the governments around the world, has triggered the deepest recession since World War II, and potentially since the 1930s. Latest estimates from the World Bank predict a 5% fall in global GDP this year. The IMF sees a $12.5 trillion shortfall in global income compared to pre-COVID projections. In the World Bank's baseline scenario, the pandemic is expected to push the majority of countries into recession this year, with widespread declines in per capita output. Advanced economies are projected to shrink by 7% in 2020. Widespread social distancing measures, sharp tightening of financial conditions, and a collapse in external demand all depress activity. Even assuming that the outbreak remains under control and economic activity recovers in the latter part of this year, China's GDP growth is projected to slow to barely 1% in 2020, by far the lowest growth in over 40 years. Overall, emerging markets GDP is forecast to contract by 2.5% in 2020, the worst performance since at least 1960. Countries that rely heavily on international trade, commodity exports and tourism will suffer the most. However, this baseline forecast assumes that the pandemic then recedes, allowing lockdowns and social distancing measures to be lifted, and cross-border restrictions eased during the second half of the year. Even then, a 4.2% recovery in 2021 will not restore output to previously expected levels. The World Bank's frankly optimistic upside scenario assumes a sharp economic rebound following the near-term lifting of pandemic control measures. Government stimulus packages are successful in restoring consumer and investor confidence, and financial markets, business activity and consumer demand normalise. Even in this unlikely scenario, a 3% contraction in global GDP this year would be much larger than anything seen during the global financial crisis. And in their downside scenario, the World Bank assumes that COVID-19 outbreaks persist longer than expected, with restrictions on movement and interactions, prolonging the disruption to domestic activity, further lowering confidence. This leads to more widespread business failures, killed off by debt servicing and a collapse in demand. At a country level, historically high debt obligations lead to widespread sovereign defaults and financial crises. Under this scenario, global growth would shrink by 8% in 2020, and the subsequent recovery would be sluggish, barely 1% next year, hampered by severely impaired balance sheets, heightened financial market stress, and more bankruptcies. Next slide. So with these potential economic backdrops to select from, how should we think about aviation's post-COVID crisis? The airline industry has now reached the end of the first phase of what I think is a four-step process: shutdown. The industry settled into stage 2, suspended animation. The timing of the next two stages, recovery and the new normal, is still impossible to determine. The invisible enemy remains poorly understood. It can't currently be controlled. And in this respect, it's very different from previous external systemic shocks, making comparisons of only academic interest. We can't presume to successfully apply lessons from the past. There are still too many uncertainties. We don't know when or whether COVID will re-emerge in subsequent waves. We don't know if, once stricken, individuals become immune for any period of time. We don't have a vaccine, nor do we know whether vaccination would be effective as a one-off or would become an annual requirement, like the flu jab. We don't have a clear steer from governments on how existing measures might be loosened or new measures introduced. Critically, there is no sign of a coordinated global effort on the horizon. Meanwhile, global economies are in a tailspin, heading to the deepest recession since the 1930s. Millions will be unemployed, countless businesses will fail, income levels and savings will fall, and there will be little money left for discretionary spending. And on top of all of that, there's the fear factor, raised to the nth power by government messages and the health experts, fanned by the media. Fear of catching coronavirus, fear of passing it on to others, fear of needing treatment for other life-threatening afflictions, fear of being old, and fear of flying. The economists have no idea whether the recovery will be U-shaped or L-shaped, or possibly another letter such as W if secondary virus spikes emerge. But the chances of a V-shaped recovery have already receded, and it's clear that air travel will be one of the last sectors to come back on stream. Next slide. So what will the restart look like? Well, we can speculate with a degree of confidence, I think. As the pandemic continued to spread around the world, the earliest affected countries began to return to a sort of normality some 3 to 4 months after their initial lockdowns. In addition to China, where industrial and manufacturing businesses have started to return to work in the past few weeks, other parts of Asia also began to unlock and restore essential services. Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam, and India were prominent amongst Asia-Pacific countries to have restarted domestic airline activity. Unfortunately, the recent recurrence of positive test results in a COVID cluster in Beijing, as well as flare-ups in several other countries, is a reminder that even this modest progress may falter. Any expansion to include regional flights will inevitably take more time, and in Asia will happen on a country-to-country basis as nations begin to reopen their borders bilaterally. Long-haul travel seems a long way off there. But a similar pattern will develop in other regions as the pandemic runs its course and the risk of further contagion diminishes to an acceptable level. More governments are now starting to realise that there is no perfect outcome that protects both health and the economy. And increasingly, the pressure of deep economic recession, record unemployment, burgeoning national debt, and a steeply rising business failure rate will force a pattern of reopening that may be faster than the health experts would deem prudent, and unfortunately is also likely to be of a stop-start nature. Similarly, air travel will be restored gradually, probably haltingly and on a rolling basis, starting with domestic markets and within discrete regions such as the Schengen area, where the necessary rules and regulations can be set and agreed within one body of government. Interregional travel will come later, with full-blown long-haul intercontinental flights much further down the line, and again subject to bilateral government approvals. With most of the globe still closed to international travel, and tourism and the Northern Hemisphere summer already underway, it's looking increasingly likely that there will be a widespread abandonment of vacation plans that involve overseas travel. Instead, staycations will provide a welcome boost to domestic resorts, although the locals may not be as welcoming as usual. And all of these impediments and setbacks mean that airlines will have to take a cautious approach to adding capacity back. It is inevitable that network restoration will move ahead faster than traffic will return, and perhaps by some margin. But airlines will also be keen to keep operating losses to a minimum, whilst at the same time offering deeply discounted fares to stimulate and encourage demand. There will inevitably be a fine balance between offering a network density that shows commitment and confidence, the "hey look, we're back" message, and running too far ahead of demand and precipitating another liquidity crisis. The task is complicated by the fact that established yield management algorithms will no longer work. The airlines will be flying blind. So in a sense then, airlines are better off grounded, but they know they can't stay in limbo forever. In order for travellers to return, clarity from the airlines is essential. Passengers need to know what to expect and what is expected of them. The need for clear communications with customers has never been more important. Over and above the difficulties of planning travel around border closures, quarantine requirements, travel insurance, the status of hotels, restaurants, ground transport, and leisure infrastructure, there are real and valid concerns amongst the travelling public regarding their safety, not only on board flights, but also throughout the entire journey to and through the airport, and on their arrival. To meet these concerns, airlines have been actively promoting the safety measures that they will be implementing on board, as well as in the airports. These include additional cleaning and disinfecting of aircraft, adapting the onboard product, the wearing of protective clothing and masks by crew, with a requirement for passengers also to wear a face covering, and promoting the technology applied to cabin air circulation and filtration. Airlines have also eased up on restrictions around rebooking and cancellation, allowing passengers maximum flexibility to change their minds and their plans as circumstances change. Refunds remain a more thorny issue, but that's more about timeliness than availability. Airports are also developing their own return to travel procedures, including one-way systems for social distancing, temperature checks, and streamlined queuing arrangements. And the EU recently issued guidelines for airlines and airports. All of these measures having a gradual effect in coaxing travellers back into the air. But a global set of standards and practices covering airports, airlines, hotels, and all other elements of the leisure industry will be needed before international travel can begin to feel normal again. Even when all of these practical issues have been addressed, airlines still face significant difficulties in planning the course of their recovery. While governments may reopen borders and allow airlines and passengers to fly again, the fundamental growth drivers of passenger demand have been severely disrupted by COVID-19. Business travel represents the most valuable traffic segment for airlines and would normally recover in line with global and regional economic activity. Unfortunately, too many businesses will no longer exist in a recessionary post-COVID world, which could remove a substantial part of the installed frequent traveller base. In addition, the experience of businesses during the lockdown period is likely to have persuaded some, at least, that remote working is now at an acceptable level of efficiency, and they therefore budget for a lower level of business travel going forward. But let's face it, most air travel and the source of the majority of the growth potential for this industry is in the leisure market. The majority of the 200 million new passenger journeys that were recently being added to the market each year are either workers in emerging markets or leisure travellers in developed economies. Both groups are dependent on stable levels of disposable income, which will now be severely reduced, with workers across the globe locked down, suffering loss of income, facing long-term redundancy, and living off their savings. This depletion of personal balance sheets and safety nets is going to prevent many of them from quickly returning to the skies, even when normal service is resumed. So when all of this is added together, it's very clear that market behaviour is not going to mirror past recoveries. Traffic, it should not be expected to bounce back quickly. A recent IATA survey reported in the last week shows a disappointing reduction in public confidence compared to the same survey from April. The proportion of passengers willing to resume flying immediately following the end of the pandemic or within a couple of months has fallen from 60% to 45%, while the number of passengers saying they would wait at least 6 to 12 months has increased from 36 to 50%. And in the UK, following the introduction of a 14-day mandatory quarantine for all arrivals, 77% of Brits surveyed said they would not holiday abroad if they had to quarantine on their return. And a slightly lower 68% do not plan to travel internationally for the next 6 months. So, next slide, please. To summarise then, what are the essential moving parts needed to facilitate a reasonably turbulence-free return to the airways? Firstly, a coordinated government approach to market access. Agreement on how and when borders reopen must be forged on a global basis, or at least a regional basis, rather than reliance on bilateral decisions. There needs to be a single international set of protocols and processes that dictate how travellers are going to be ensured their safety using consistent procedures. It needs to be the same wherever they go, whichever airport they use, however they travel, same tests, same processes. Another helpful measure would be for governments to underwrite travel insurers so that the previous levels of cover can be restored, including support in the end of a COVID diagnosis or disruption. Many passengers who would otherwise be travelling are looking at their invalid or unavailable insurance policies and saying, I can't risk it. And finally, in order for leisure travel to become appealing again, governments and businesses must work together to figure out how to reopen hotels, bars, restaurants, cafes, concert venues, theme parks, in fact, all the places that tourists want and need to function safely and seamlessly. Next slide, please. And then on the other hand, what needs to be knocked on the head quickly and firmly? Well, for sure, social distancing on board has to be a non-starter. Blocking off middle seats or alternate rows makes no difference. It's completely uneconomic. I always love flying in the Viscount with its big seats and even bigger windows, but we can't turn the clock back 50 years. Blanket quarantine requirements amount to travel bans. They will kill any prospect of recovery. Safe travel corridors and air bridges are no substitute for a clear set of agreed policies, such as those set out for travel within the EU. The potential for individual government intervention is too high. Advice changes too frequently to be useful. And governments must be supportive of all of their air service operators, not just those that they've a vested interest in protecting. A recent example of Austria imposing a minimum airfare of 40 euros is nonsense, simply unfair, and very unhelpful. Next slide, please. So notwithstanding all of the obstacles to recovery, in recent weeks we've actually started to see the first signs of a return to the air. Not big numbers to be sure, but significant enough and a good indicator that the human race still has a desire for travel in its DNA. We passed the peak of fleet inactivity in mid-April, and since then there's been progress in all regions and across all aircraft fleet segments. For sure, there are some anomalies. Wide-body recovery, for example, is misleadingly high on these charts, driven up by the use of passenger aircraft for cargo operations. The latest data show that over 40% of the global passenger fleet still remains idle, but there are big differences between the extremes. 75% of UK airline capacity inactive versus less than 10% in China. Now, of course, these flight indicators only track seats and flights, not passenger numbers and revenues. But as a great man once said, this isn't the end, it's not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning. Next slide, please. So on that finally more optimistic note, I'll move on to the next piece of the puzzle and look at the implications of a changing world on airline fleets, business models, finances, and indeed survivability. Next slide. It seems pretty clear to me that in order to survive and thrive in the post-COVID world, airlines are going to have to fundamentally rethink their fleets, their business models, and their finances. This process won't always lead to change, but a simple return to business as usual is not on the cards. Any airline that assumes otherwise is unlikely to survive for long. Firstly, to put it bluntly, there are too many aircraft in the system relative to the realistic prospects for recovery well beyond the restart phase. The new normal in many markets, and for the industry as a whole, is going to be a smaller industry. We won't see a market This will regrettably also have losses, well below those which have already been announced or mooted. Next slide. Can we have the next slide, please? Okay, oh, now we're running well ahead. No, we're not. Right sizing the fleets. Okay, and maybe the next slide. So fleet rationalization is already underway. Of course it is. We hear about this almost every day. We're reading another announcement of fleet retirements and reductions. The process is going to continue and accelerate, though, with the fleet decisions addressing a number of objectives. Firstly, in the interest of efficiency, most airlines are going to retire their oldest, least efficient and least reliable fleets first, or to bring them back into service last. In line with the experience of previous shock events, it's likely that the remaining fleets of early generation and obsolete aircraft will not see active service again in any scale. These range from the handfuls of remaining DC-9s and 737-200s through MD-80s, 737 Classics, through to include A340s and many of the remaining passenger 747s, 757s, 767s. As airlines look for greater efficiencies, they'll also seek to simplify and rationalize their fleets, cutting down on subfleets, eliminating models that do a similar job to others that they will retain, or perhaps sacrificing a multi-supplier OEM policy for the single source benefits of crew commonality, training and maintenance. Right sizing will play perhaps the most important role in airline restructuring plans, as traffic levels will no longer support the largest family members, at least not in the proportions that had previously been envisaged within fleet mixes. This presents an obvious challenge for A380s, but is also likely to extend to 777s, A350-1000s and 787-10s in the wide-body spectrum, as well as having an impact on the mix of A321neos and larger 737 MAXes delivering within the single-aisle programs. Regional aircraft, including the small mainline A220s and E-jets, may well have an early advantage in this remix, as they present significantly lower risk in a world of uncertain demand. But looking further into the future, an alternative scenario might see lower frequencies traded for larger gauge aircraft, especially if business travel remains subdued. This right-siding process will extend beyond the delivered fleets, of course, and will have a significant impact on existing order books and future ordering activity. I don't think many airlines will be looking to add new capacity for a while. They'll have more than enough surplus capacity available to deploy from within their idle fleets. Equally, lease renewals are likely to be fewer and farther between, and new lease placements harder to secure. The last category of aircraft becoming surplus to requirements here are those that are released from airlines that have already failed and ceased operations, or are in such a precarious situation that their demise may safely be anticipated. A higher proportion of these aircraft will be relatively young vintages that ordinarily would be redeployed into other operators. Under the new normal, though, they're likely to hang around in the surplus inventory park for much longer, competing with other similar aircraft released by right-sizing airlines, those naturally coming off lease, and new builds delivering from the OEMs. In total, if you combine these four channels of fleet reduction, you get to around 5,000 aircraft, half of which will become surplus and compete for future placement as the market recovers, half of which will find their way either into the cargo conversion pipeline or into long-term storage and ultimately being withdrawn from use. 5,000 aircraft is almost 20% of the delivered fleet. But this is unlikely to be the final tally, as the process will extend over several iterations as the industry fine-tunes its requirements. Next slide, please. So the aphorism, "never let a good crisis go to waste," again, generally attributed Churchill, although I'm doubtful that he actually uttered those words. Next slide. In any event, the advice is particularly sound today. Airlines have never been in a more pressing existential situation where bold and far-reaching decisions need to be taken. I'm also reminded of the reply made by an Ernest Hemingway character when asked how he went bankrupt. 2 ways, he replied: gradually, then suddenly. Reshaping a business to be a survivor and thriver in the new normal requires a holistic four-step process, where each of the focused areas that are identified on this slide will inevitably interact with other areas and with a wider industry picture. We already talked about the fleet, which is perhaps the most tangible of the moving parts, but fleet changes will inevitably be influenced by decisions taken on the route network and the traffic flows across the network. These in turn will be influenced by the core elements selected for the go-forward business, and to the extent that the focus here changes, will have consequences for the product offering, the brand, and the franchise. But perhaps this last area should actually be the starting point for a deeper introspection. What is the franchise going to look like in the new normal, and in the context of a changing cast of players and competitors? However strong the brand and franchise have been in the past, do they stand up and continue to have a role in the future marketplace? Most importantly, can the business be profitable? Or more realistically, which bits of the business can be profitable? But this is a unique opportunity to build back the business layer by layer with a laser eye on enterprise value and profit contribution. The future airline industry route map is likely to be a good deal less dense than the one we've gotten used to. But this is the time to lop off overgrown branches, cut out dead wood, eliminate loss-making sectors flown to utilize excess capacity or to protect slots. Now, so far I've not mentioned sustainability, but make no mistake, the issue's not gone away. It will be with us, and it will be back with a vengeance soon enough. The industry has set some extremely challenging targets for itself, including a 50% reduction in carbon emissions by 2050 compared to 2005. The actions needed to make real progress on that front will need to be woven into the plans rising from the wreckage of COVID-19. And what are the fourth element here? Buttressing the financials. This will be absolutely critical to survival and thrival. Over the coming months, liquidity pressures will be greater than ever as DOCs inevitably grow back faster than revenues. So reinforcing relationships with lenders, investors, and the capital markets will be vital. In the longer term, the ability to tell a compelling story around the new business model with a more efficient fleet, a tighter and more profitable network, and a leaner, meaner fixed cost structure will dictate the scale and the cost of raising capital to take the business forward. So how could the post-COVID world affect the different airline business models? Certainly not all in the same way. Next slide. We start with the network carriers, the full-service airlines. The first thing to note is that their networks are more complex, comprising interconnecting short and long-haul routes. They also carry a more complex mix of traffic, with hub connecting passengers sitting alongside point-to-point travellers on the same aircraft. With international and long-haul routes taking longer to come back online than domestic or regional services, there's going to be a challenging imbalance of passengers on the network, since the connecting traffic at the beginning will mostly not be showing up. This shortfall could be addressed through more aggressive price stimulation to fill all of those seats, but more likely by slowing the rate of recovery in terms of capacity, slowing it down either through reducing frequency or putting on smaller aircraft. Since business travel is likely to be returning more slowly than leisure, reduced frequency would seem to be the better way to go. And don't expect the wide-body networks to get close to full strength when those markets open up again. Whilst initial service levels may be announced as a show of normality, there's likely to be high levels of cancellation and consolidation if bookings fail to materialize. On the positive side, network carriers typically have a small number of operating bases, although in the US particularly, multiple hubs are frequently used to feed traffic around the system. This could well change in the future though, with multiple options no longer supported by or needed for the lower traffic levels. Airlines serving more than one airport in larger cities are also likely to conclude that consolidation around a single point is the only rational course of action. And we've already seen this happening at Gatwick versus Heathrow. Almost by definition, network carriers operate mixed aircraft fleets to support the variety of routes and traffic levels. In the post-COVID world, there will be opportunities to rationalize route networks and reduce the number of subfleets. There are also numerous examples of full-service airlines that operate different aircraft types that actually do more or less the same job. These are not just fleets from different generations, where a replacement cycle is underway, but basically duplication. A fleet of A350s alongside 787s, for example. And eliminating these overlaps could be another opportunity to reduce costs. One feature of many full-service carriers is the amount of non-aviation activity that's retained in-house, particularly in areas such as catering and ground handling. Many of these airlines have already figured out the benefits of turning these fixed costs into variable costs by spinning off the activities and buying in the services needed while banking some additional capital. But there's still plenty of untapped potential at airlines around the world. Since many wide bodies are expected to remain on the ground for some time, the shortage of cargo capacity is going to continue. But all too many network carriers fail to properly understand or exploit the value of their cargo capabilities. I suspect that many of them will be placing a lot more focus on this particular revenue opportunity in the future. Finally, as already mentioned, the historical levels of demand for premium services and fares will be changing. This brings challenges for airlines that are heavily invested in premium cabins and products. A smaller business travel market means competition for that business will become fiercer. But it's also important that airlines right-size their capacity across all cabins to ensure that they're maximizing the potential for their operations. As first class and business capacity continues to be cut back, expect to see further increases in the size and availability of premium economy. And when first class finally disappears, the industry will discover that it's reinvented the first generation 3-class product from the early 1980s. Next slide. The challenges for the low-cost carriers are in many ways much simpler. For the most part, LCCs are short-haul, point-to-point operators, offering a single class of service with limited product choices. A single fleet type often makes further rationalization moot, although I suspect that the trend towards densification and larger gauge family members may well go into reverse for a few years until demand stabilizes. Long-haul low cost, however, will become even more challenged than it has been to date, and it was frankly never a clear winner in my mind. The announcement last week that Knox Scoot is being shut down rather confirms that view, I'm afraid, and I think we'll see a substantial reduction in dedicated long-haul budget flying. In any case, for the foreseeable future, the network carriers are going to have capacity to spare that can be priced at marginal rates to squeeze any remaining long-haul LCC competition. One common feature of the larger LCCs is their use of multiple crew and aircraft bases. This has allowed them to efficiently join the dots within their route networks and increase city pair connectivity very effectively. However, in a world of lower demand and more uncertainty around the process of travel itself, I think we'll see consolidation of LCC operating bases. And this will likely also extend to a reduction in the number of cross-border daughter companies set up by the larger LCCs, most commonly seen in Asia, often as joint ventures as a way of extending their footprint into neighbouring countries. There will also inevitably be changes required that could compromise the efficient operations that underpin the LCC business model. This could be a real challenge. The most obvious areas at risk, including high-density seating, the sale of onboard ancillaries, and the rapid aircraft turnaround times. I think this may be something that will go away in time, but in the near term, it seems to me that LCCs are not going to be operating as slickly as they have done in the past. Next slide, please. So moving on to the regional airlines, characterized by very short stage lengths, dedicated small gauge fleets, and a concentration of activity around the provision of feed for network carriers. It's something that's most obvious in North America, but it's by no means limited to that market. All of these characteristics put the regionals in a challenging position in a post-COVID world. Although the US operators are not primarily feeding long-haul connections, slower international recovery will impede regional demand. In addition, any reduction in hub operations by the majors will have a direct knock-on effect for the regionals, which would likely experience a linear reduction in their network structures. Although passenger flows will be smaller, the economics of operating 50-seat regional jets will inevitably come under the microscope again, with a likely conclusion that lower frequency with larger regional aircraft is the preferred direction of travel. And that also suggests that essential services connecting small communities are going to come under some threat. Next slide. Once again, recent history has shown up the fragility of the inclusive tour charter business with the failure of Thomas Cook last September. The European holiday travel market has become even more challenging since then, with summer cancelled or at least severely curtailed for European vacationers. I suspect the situation is no different in other markets where there is a seasonal rush for resorts. The combination of lockdown, quarantine, travel bans, lack of insurance, and the general fear of being in close proximity to strangers has pretty much killed off the industry for now. Long-haul charter flights are not going to come back anytime soon either. And for vertically integrated tour operators like Thomas Cook and TUI, their exposure is multiplied through hotel and ground infrastructure operations. Since the market's highly seasonal, there is little prospect of an upturn until summer 2021. And who knows what the situation will be like around the turn of the year when bookings should normally be flowing in. Perhaps the greatest pain in the charter market will be felt by destination carriers, those airlines based in holiday markets such as Greece and Turkey that provide marginal capacity for the vertical tour operators and have no independent market opportunities of their own to develop as a substitute. We have seen a number of those fall by the wayside in every previous down cycle, and I think it will be no different this time. I fear also that the ACMI industry is going to be facing into a lean time, since regular airlines are now going to have more than enough spare capacity of their own to fill in for unscheduled maintenance events or peak seasonal activity. That's going to be a tough few years, I think, for ACMI. Next slide. So the cargo airlines. Well, this is about the only ray of sunshine in the industry at the moment. With 50% of the air cargo market normally in the hands of dedicated freight operators, there's a good deal of upside potential until the long-haul passenger markets get back in the air, with the lack of belly-hold capacity providing integrators and dedicated general freight carriers with additional demand and higher yields. The lockdown has pushed even more people towards online shopping, purchasing goods that are in many cases shipped by air from manufacturers in markets such as China, either directly to customers or to retailers' warehouses. The availability of large numbers of late midlife narrow bodies will boost the feedstock of affordable freighter conversion candidates, and that will provide a further boost for air cargo growth. The lot of the narrow body capacity readily absorbed by China, but also substantial increases in capacity for the leading integrators and e-commerce platforms such as Amazon Prime, Alibaba, and JD.com. Next slide, please. So that brings us on to the final piece of the restructuring and reconfiguration process, which is underpinning and fixing the finances. Next slide. Financial robustness is clearly essential for an airline's survival, but too many airlines are starting from a low base that's been further eroded to the point of collapse over the last several months. Airlines must not only take stock of their current situation, but also develop a range of future scenarios to assess the financial resources they need to avoid insolvency, rebuild their balance sheets, and reinvest for the future. Now, this is by definition a complex process that's going to consume a lot of resources from across the company. It shouldn't be the sole responsibility of the CFO and the finance team, though, although they will be central to the process. But the responsibility should go much wider. And the process consists of 4 primary activities, each with its own subset of requirements, outputs, and focus areas. All of these plates must be kept spinning. No mean feat when the day-to-day has to be dealt with as well. Keeping track of near-term cash sources and uses is obviously vital to avoid an early demise. But managing commitments to ensure that longer-term obligations can also be covered has to be a priority as well. Where there are doubts or concerns, outgoings will need to be reduced and restructured. In doing so, it will be important to pick not just the most impactful targets, but those with the highest probability of success. And then it will be necessary to engage with the stakeholders in an informed and realistic manner, trying to understand their situation, to find a pragmatic middle ground in negotiation that works for all and at least shares the pain. The airline landscape is going to look very different in the post-COVID world, and that will have a significant impact on the businesses of other stakeholders, from the OEMs to the lessors and lenders, right out to the MROs, airports, and ground handling companies, and well beyond. Undoubtedly, there will be pain. But for those businesses that can find a path through the challenges and emerge as stronger, leaner, and more focused entities, the future still looks positive. But it does look a long way off, though. So I'm going to conclude there and hand over to Niels to share some of the questions that have been coming in. Thank you for listening.
Okay, so I have a question first from Oriel Kaufman. How do we ensure a level playing field between airlines which benefit from government support and those who don't?
Yeah, I think that is a challenge. As I said, I mean, I do think Ryanair, Michael O'Leary, has a point, because it's at one level does appear to penalise the most prudent and the most financially well managed, if you like, airlines, the ones that have prepared the ground for the bad times. Why should they be forced to give up any of that advantage? And under normal circumstances, I think I would say absolutely. The EU competition rules are absolutely right. You stand and fall on your own merits and the quality of your own businesses. But these are not normal times. And we are in danger, country after country after country is in danger of losing its homegrown air services. It's too important for a country's economy, from society, from infrastructure, from communications. You can't let that wither and die. So to protect that, I think the provision of short-term support, whether it's a direct grant of money or whether it's sovereign guarantee for loans or whether it's help in securing a bond rating, whatever it is, that short-term boost, I think, is justified given where we are today. It should not extend to airline or to governments insisting on taking control and command of the airlines that they're helping. But having said that, as I pointed out, I don't think it's unreasonable that there should be some sort of investment recognition, either in terms of stock warrants or in terms of an equity grant to the taxpayer, not to the governments, but to the taxpayers, to recognise the contribution they're making. And hopefully there's an upside at the end of this. The stock markets are all over the place, up and down, and they will continue to be so. But hopefully the airlines that are being supported will come out of it in the market conditions stronger and will give a return to the people who've invested with them. So I think there's a balance, but I think it's inevitable given the severity of the situation that we're in, that we are going to see government support continue to grow.
Okay. So Peter Neglin has a question. He says, Dick, what is your view on aircraft retirements? How many and how soon? Which aircraft types are the most vulnerable here?
Well, I think I listed the obvious ones. In terms of retirements, I mean, the oldest and least efficient and the least reliable are going to get cleared out first. And that's what we saw after 9/11. It's what we saw in a lesser extent coming through the global financial crisis. So aircraft that are 30, 35 years old and still being used, very low utilizations, they're not just going to appear less and less frequently. We're going to see the last of the MD-80 and MD-90 fleets, I think, move out pretty quickly. I think Delta's pretty much, the last holdout, and they've already told us what they plan to do. I think we'll see a clear out of 737 Classics. I also think we're going to see more of what American Airlines did with their oldest 737-800s. Some of those very recent, but now slightly post-generational narrow-body aircraft, they've been around for 20, 21, 22, 24 years. I think they will be amongst the last to be returned to service, and inevitably some of them won't make it. Now, there's good feedstock within that for cargo conversion, so it won't all be bad news. Equally, 757s, 767s, again, great feedstock for freighters. That won't solve all of the problem, and a lot of those are going to end up in the desert from whence they will not return. On the wide-body side, I mentioned the large wide-bodies, and I think inevitably, given the very poor prognosis for a rapid recovery of the long-haul international wide-body markets, it'll be the smallest family members that have the advantage here, and the biggest ones are going to be most challenged. And I think everyone now has formed a view around what's going to happen to A380s. It's probably a little bit overstated because we tend to bounce from one extreme to another. But heck, 98% of the A380s delivered are stored. They're not flying. And frankly, Tim Clark saying that he's going to put A380s back in the air from the 15th of July, flying between Dubai and I think Paris and London. There's going to be plenty of social distancing on those flights, because where are people going to be going to board those aeroplanes? So, I think the big wide bodies are going to be underutilized for a good long period of time.
Here's an interesting question from Shanit Demel. Do you think that the COVID-19 restrictions gradually easing and some incumbent airlines ceasing trading, could it be almost a perfect time for airline startups?
Yeah, I mean, counterintuitively, sure. I mean, there will certainly be people looking at the window of opportunity and thinking, I could jump into that space. The trouble is, it's not a well-defined space. You don't know what you're jumping into. More importantly, neither do your investors, neither do your bankers, nor do the capital markets. So I think unless you are funding this out of your own Cayman Islands bank account, you're going to be really challenged to get this thing operating and off the ground from a financing perspective.
So Ed O'Veyer, he has a question. Will lessors be able to handle the accelerated rate at which aircraft will be depreciating? Placing a mid-aged aircraft is near impossible these days, given the increasing supply of aircraft and disappearance for additional capacity.
Yeah, look, I think asset values, steeper depreciations, and potential impairments are clearly going to be featuring extensively in conversations all around the industry, but particularly in conversations with the appraiser community, by investors, lenders, lessors. Less so, I think, with airlines. And with airlines, it's more I think, going to be to do with the extent to which they're using their aircraft as collateral for financing. And their lenders are going to come at them and saying, well, hang on, but my collateral's not what it was. So we're going to have to look at restructuring those loans or whatever that facility is. So I think for the airlines, given the extent to which many of them actually have the assets on their books, it's less of a problem. And airlines, as we know, will tend to take steeper depreciation curves anyway. So unless it's a very new aircraft, the problem is going to be a lot smaller than it would be for a banker or a lessor.
Okay. Piyush Bansal has asked, while cargo airlines fundamentals remain weak, what are your thoughts on airlines using the upper deck to transport cargo in the short term?
Well, I think it will continue in the short term, and certainly where there's no alternative for using an A330, for example, why wouldn't you continue to take a piece of the air cargo market? Because, as I say, if belly holds wide body capacity is not available because passenger services are not being operated, there is going to be a squeeze on cargo capacity. And it's not all going to be accommodated on dedicated freighters. So, as I said, a lot of airlines, far too many airlines, have no real idea of the value of the revenue earning capability, of the cost implications of carrying cargo on their passenger airplanes. But I think a lot more are going to be sharpening their pencils and looking at a way of getting some short-term value out of the constraints in the cargo market. As I say, if you're not going to be flying your A330s or 787s on passenger services, if you can get the economics right, why not put 15 tons of low-density cargo on the main deck? But it's going to have to be low density. It can't be high-density general cargo. So you're a bit limited in the bits of the market that you can get involved in. And most of what we've seen happening up until now has been emergency medical supplies, masks, PPE, very low density stuff.
Dick, Nico Buchholz has come up with a question that is quite profound. You mentioned that airlines need to rethink their fleets, but that implies just improving but not really changing. Do airlines really need aircraft? Or more specifically, what is an airline?
Well, Nico will know that I have dropped this idea into conversations in the past, that the airline industry has been moving more towards the hotel and hospitality sector in terms of what it owns and how it presents and delivers its product. So 20 years ago, if you were checking into a Hilton or a Marriott or a Sheraton hotel, the physical property that you checked into would be owned by that hotel chain. It would be part of the portfolio, would be on the balance sheet, it would be part of what they did. Today, in almost every case, the property that you walk into is not owned by the Hiltons or the Marriotts. It's been sold and is operated under a franchise arrangement with a hotel management company that deliver the very specific Hilton or Marriott brand that's dictated. Airlines have started to go down that road, and we are increasingly witness the 40+% share of aircraft financing that goes through the lessor channel. We are increasingly seeing airlines stepping back from owning aircraft and having them as assets on their books and using them at arm's length to deliver a product and a brand. Now that works in both long haul and short haul, but we can see that the brand is more prominently displayed and more strongly delivered on wide body aircraft. But we may well get to a point where some airlines will be virtual in terms of not actually owning and actually not even operating the aircraft themselves. We see that in bits and pieces around the world. if Nico were flying between Dublin and Hartford, Connecticut a year ago, he'd have been on an Aer Lingus 757, looked like an Aer Lingus 757, painted like an Aer Lingus 757. Cabin crew were Aer Lingus, but it was operated by ASL. So it was an ACMI charter operation. Extend that over a much wider subsegment of the market. Absolutely. Why not?
Thank you. Dick, I have a question. What do you think about the future of aircraft leasing after this pandemic? As opposed to ownership?
Sorry, as opposed to?
Aircraft lease, as opposed to aircraft ownership by the airline directly.
Well, I think we are going to see another step up in the share of ownership for lessors, because what we've seen in the last 3 months is only the beginning of a process of making that next step, where we have seen airlines aggressively searching for ways of generating liquidity from their balance sheets. So any assets that are not already secured, they don't have a mortgage attached to them, they're not part of a loan structure, anything that's unencumbered is up for grabs. And they are reaching out to the leasing community saying, can we talk about a sale and leaseback? And we've seen a couple of $1 billion probably worth of airplanes already transact. These are used aircraft. These are 1, 2, 5, maybe 10 years old. But again, why would the airlines be burning through their preciously and hard-won cash reserves, paying for aircraft to go on their balance sheets? Why would they not move more firmly into the leasing space? So I think, whereas a couple of years ago, in my head, I was struggling to square the maths of getting from 42% to 50% share for the leasing sector, I think we can easily imagine stepping 42 to 45 to 46, and over the next 10 years, probably moving towards 50, because I think cash will continue to be king.
Okay. And what about the fate of the MAXs that have been built already and not delivered? Will they be delivered to their original customers? Will there be cancellations? Will they then go to other operators? How do you see that play out?
Oh, I think it will be a mix. I mean, it's pretty clear they won't all go to their original customers, because every picture I see includes 3 or 4 Jet Airways aircraft. So, I mean, there are clear examples where they're not going to go to their original customers. And in some cases, that will be a respray. In other cases, more money will need to be spent. And in some of those cases, it's going to be a problem that's dumped in the laps of leasing companies. But I think all of those aircraft are going to get delivered. The question for me is over what time period. And in my head, it's gone from pretty much done by the end of 21 to it could stretch into the beginning of 2023. But we just don't know, because we don't have a start point, let alone an end point.
Then, Dick, I have a question from Mamoon Kusbari at Novus Aviation Capital. Between government-owned airlines and restructured ones, in Chapter 11, for example, how can airlines that have been disciplined with low leverage and well-capitalized be rewarded in this period?
Well, that goes back to, I think, the first question. In a normal world, you would not want to see bad habits rewarded. But we all know, in particularly in the US, you go into a bankruptcy protection process and you can come out of it significantly stronger, having stepped away from a lot of your obligations. And that puts you in a very strong position. And we saw what happened, to airlines that were slow off the mark the last time around. American Airlines said, no, we're not doing that. We don't need to do that. But eventually they did. So I think, if there is a bow wave of 1110 protection filings it will inevitably spread like a coronavirus contagion across a much wider part of the segment of the industry that perhaps actually genuinely needs and deserves it. But you're right. I mean, it's these are extraordinary times. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to condone it.
I have a question from Nadeem Mohammed. How will the current crisis impact the process / method of credit underwriting of airlines?
Well, probably in the short term, it brings it to a screeching halt, and then everyone has to step back and reweight the criteria. Because if you've got a credit analysis process and system set up that worked in the old world and was appropriate in the old world, none of those metrics are going to be invalid in the new world. But the focus inevitably will change. So you don't just tear it up and say, I have no idea how I'm going to do this in the future. You say, okay, let's re-rank all of the financial and the non-financial elements and see how they stack up to be appropriate in the new world. And that probably means making some assumptions about the competitive environment and what that will look like. So I think you'd shift your weighting more towards short to medium term financial robustness. So all about liquidity and solvency. That takes a higher profile, although it should already have been pretty high. And then you look at how the airlines are approaching their capacity, their backlog, and their ability to finance that backlog against a backdrop of what their new competitive environment is going to look like, both in terms of the markets, passenger markets and cargo markets even, that they're focused on, and who they're going to be competing against, because that backdrop will have entirely changed. So it's not a question of just updating from the last quarter. It's going back and effectively building up from scratch. So there will have to be a lot of one-on-one conversations with every one of those counterparties to start over again. Okay, I heard what you said when I was there in January. Now tell me what your world looks like now and what you think it will look like in 12 months, 24 months' time. So complete reassessment, but the building blocks are still sound. You're just going to fit together in a different way.
You think that banks' loan margins and lessors' lease rental factors will go up, or will the liquidity injections by governments sustain asset prices and make these securities still very thinly priced?
Well, I think asset prices, I mean, I'm not going to stray too far into this because I think this is an area where Brighton is going to be put under the spotlight in a week's time. But I think the long-term outlook for the most efficient future generation aircraft types that aren't the biggest in their families, but will meet the go-forward scale of the industry, they're going to hold their values pretty well. And I think they will continue to be financed in similar fashion to the way that lenders thought about them in the past. Clearly, at the moment, you would expect margins to increase. You would expect a risk weighting to be layered on to any transactions that are running through the market. But frankly, some of the pricing that I've seen out there on debt and also on other financing structures, you haven't seen the spreads moving out to the extent that you might expect. Maybe we'll see that, or maybe there's an element of, we're kind of comfortable with the limited, amount of business we're doing. A lot of entities are not going to be expanding dramatically. If they're comfortable with the type of business they're doing, they'll do a bit more of that and they'll tighten up around the edges. So it may not be, a complete meltdown. I would suspect it won't be.
Finian O'Neill asking, do you see a glut of supply into the cargo conversion market from passenger aircraft retirements that would hurt lease rentals on existing freighters?
I wouldn't call it a glut. I mean, clearly there's going to be a lot of opportunity in terms of availability, and I think given the way the markets are going to go in the medium term, affordability will bring those back in the frame. So the pacing item is probably going to be conversion slots rather than feedstock, and I suspect for the next number of years, the rate at which the market will be able to process conversions will still be slower than the level at which the cargo market can absorb, particularly narrow-body freighter aircraft. And I'm looking here not only at the FedExes and Amazon Primes, but also the Chinese domestic market. And bear in mind, China has not got a FedEx, it's not got a UPS. It has got an Amazon, but so far it hasn't got a cargo dedicated freighter business in the scale that you might expect it to have developed given the size of the market.
We have time for one last question from Mark Allison. Dick, as the EU begins to allow certain countries without quarantine, where does the UK stand in this process as far as receiving tourists? Or is it clear yet? For example, is it likely Americans will be banned to enter the UK, or will the 14-day quarantine continue? Thanks.
Mark, I think you know the answer to this. Claire will be welcome. You will not.
All right, Dick. Thank you so much for this. Very interesting. And thank you, everybody who attended.